Right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the We Validate Community of Practice webinar series. For those who are joining us in a webinar for the first time, we created this community of practice last year to provide a virtual space for CGE researchers and partners to sort of share information and best practices around developing and validating women's empowerment metrics. So if you're curious about the previous webinars we have hosted, or you're interested in presenting your work in this space, please let us know. And earlier this year, we created a subgroup under the Gender Platform D groups to facilitate easy communications and information sharing. So and we currently have about 130 members. If you're not part of this group or you're interested in joining, please subscribe using the link that I will share just in a minute after this intro. So today's webinar is on measuring collective agency in agri-food systems and will be presented by a number of CG colleagues who are with us today here. And let me just quickly introduce all of them.
Hi.
So we have
Ruth. There's a webinar I've just shared if you're interested on collective something and agri-food systems.
Could you please mute yourself? I wasn't sure who it was. Thank you. Okay, so we have Ruth Mainzendick, who's a senior research fellow with the Natural Resources and Resilience NRR unit of IFPRI. We have Hagar Aldidi, who's a senior research analyst also in the NRR unit at IFPRI. Audrey Pereira is a PhD student in public policy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We have Jessica Heckert, who's a research fellow in the Poverty, Gender, and Inclusion PGI unit at IFPRI. And Katrina Kosek is a senior research fellow also in the PGI unit at IFPRI. And Eileen Enchanji is a gender and social inclusion expert working with the Alliance of Biodiversity International, NCIAT, and the Pan-Africa Bean Research Alliance program, PABRA. And last but not least, we have Greg Seymour, who's a research fellow with the NRR unit of IFPRI. Welcome, everyone. And this webinar will include multiple short presentations, and we want to make sure that we have some time for a discussion at the end. So we have allocated 75 minutes for this webinar. And of course, we understand that some of you may need to leave promptly in an hour, but hope many of you can stay until the end. And just finally, as usual, please use the chat to ask questions and share your comments and engage with the speakers and other participants. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Ruth to take us forward. You're muted, Ruth.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are you seeing the screen correctly?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks very much on this. Really excited to be presenting on this study. We started out, many of us have been working on measuring empowerment for many years, but a lot of the measures of empowerment have been at the individual level. And we know that it's very important to look beyond that. So we put together this proposal under the Gender Platforms Methods module for looking at collective agency. And so we'll be going through this. Let's see. We know that collective agency is very important. It's that power with, the power with others. And the importance of that has been reflected in the number of large investment in group-based development projects in general. Anytime they want to reach large numbers of farmers or things like that, it seems like there's a group-based project, and especially in women's empowerment related projects, there's often a group-based approach. And yet there are very few indicators of this collective agency, especially those at the group level, not just the individual. And very often, the indicators that there are about whether they are instrumental in meeting certain objectives, often those externally defined by the projects, not the really empowerment effects of this. So this is an important gap for research as well as for external impact assessments, and particularly for internal self-assessment by groups. So we put together this project to develop measures of collective agency and apply those to different kinds of groups with different gender compositions, working with our partners in India, Uganda, Nigeria, and Guatemala. We did this because you need measures to address a range of research questions, such as how effective are different types of groups in enabling women to achieve collective agency. And those might be producer or microfinance groups, resource management groups, all male or mixed gender groups. We don't know which are most effective. And there are two parts to this. Are the group goals aligned with women's objectives, and is the group able to achieve its goals? Then there are questions of what types of groups, what types of women or men are able to exercise voice and agency in those different types of groups, and how is group effectiveness and agency of different types of women and men shaped by features of the group, especially its structure and decision-making processes, and factors external to the group. So our methods in this project have been a synthetic review of the literature, an expert workshop, and drawing on lessons from studies that we're working with in and we're working with implementation partners to develop these measures related to collective agency of women within different types of groups. So we're starting in the conceptual framework, we're starting with Naila Kabir's framework of looking at resources as the precondition for agency, agency leading to achievements, and achievements in turn creating new resources for future rounds. That's been quite widely used, especially at the individual level. We're then looking at two levels, the individual level, but especially the group level, those same processes. But what do we mean then by collective agency? At the individual level, it's been variously defined in terms of the capacity to pursue individuals' own perception of good, both self-regarding and other-regarding goals, as a result of membership in a collective, or engagement in or leadership of groups, networks with shared goals. At the collective level, the collective agency is the group's or network's perceived ability to come together, establish common goals or shared interests, and take action to attain those goals or interests, or the collective's capacity to pursue perceptions of the good. Then there's I'm going to spend some time going over these definitions, because what we're finding is that unless you have those definitions and those concepts clear, you can't measure it. Collective efficacy extends the notion of self-efficacy to organizations and groups, and usually refers to beliefs about collective capacities in specific domains. That's beliefs of the group members concerning the performance capacity or capability of a social system as a whole, and the respondents' confidence in the power of the community to work together for positive change in the interest of the community. We've pulled a lot of these definitions from different studies, and we've screened them for ones where there's kind of a core of common elements in this, and discarded some that are more off or defining things just for their particular project. But you see how these kind of cluster. Then collective action is pursuit of a goal or set of goals by two or more individuals who work together. So how does this map onto our framework? Well, we've got the definition of collective agency. That then collective efficacy is the belief about that leading to collective action. If you have that, then the collective action can lead to achievements. Then we'll circle back and look at those resources, and particular resources that are relevant for this are social capital and community capacity. And then another thing that isn't brought in here beautifully is that all of this is affected by both external forces and the structure of the groups themselves and the individual capabilities of the members. Social capital then is that degree of, again, social capital is often measured at either the individual or the collective level. I'm just focusing on the collective. It's the degree of social connectedness, trust, and shared values within a community, the social structure of communities, as well as the norms and values by which those communities operate, and social networks and their associated norms of reciprocity, the features of social organization and integration that facilitate cooperation for mutual benefit. And here I think that's a key aspect. The community capacity is the ability, which may come from skills, resources, and networks of a group to identify and act on problems and work together to resolve them. The dimensions of that can be identified as participation, leadership, connections, sense of place, community attitudes, and problem assessment. Now that's taken from a study that's specifically of communities, but some of this can also be applied to other types of groups and organizations that are not necessarily a community. Okay, what do we mean by achievements when we apply it to the collective level? These are often externally defined depending on the type of group and who set it up. And those could be like the amount that's collectively marketed by producer organizations, or income increases for self-help groups, or improvements in the quality of the natural resources for natural resource management groups, water user associations, or forest user groups. But the question is, how do the groups themselves define their objectives and achievements? And how do different members within the groups define and value those collective achievements? Those could be different members, men versus women, or women and men of low caste, high caste, different ethnicities in mixed groups. I mentioned that we had an expert workshop that really highlighted this need for better and more appropriate tools to capture the nuances and get away from the notion that just forming the groups is the same as creating collective agency. There's also a need to integrate the views of researchers, practitioners who are involved in mobilizing women's groups, and the grassroots organizations themselves. We need to understand what's happening in the group's environment and examine questions of social capital and structural transformation that result. And agency seems to be missing from a lot of the instruments and indicators. Those that are talking about the collective are usually looking at group performance and functioning, not the agency aspect. There was also a call to expand the measures of group outcomes beyond economic outcomes, and almost all those indicators that are currently used are externally defined. rather than the things that the group itself necessarily defines. What does this mean for measurement? Well, a lot of these are latent constructs. They're an underlying concept that we know is important, but it's not something as directly measurable. But if you want to measure it, you still need clarity on what we're considering. Also, we need a lot more at the collective level, but we have to be aware of differences in individual values and experiences within the collective. And we need to balance between measures that are specific to the project and context versus ones that have broader comparability. Spoiler alert here, we originally thought that working across these different projects, we would be able to come out with one core set of measures, like we have with, for example, the WEAI and pro-WEAI. This proved much more challenging here, in part because the groups that we're working with each have very different objectives. And so given our commitment to working with what the groups themselves want, this, was one of the results. We have this portfolio of partner projects, and I'll let each of the we'll hear from somebody talking about each of these in turn. So, but broadly, we have 3 of these projects working in India. We have Uganda, Nigeria, and Guatemala as well. The types of groups we have are producer organizations, self-help groups, resource user groups, multi-stakeholder platforms, so above the level of the community, that include not only the direct users, but government and others. We have women's action committees, civil society organizations. We have both all-female groups and mixed groups. This gives us some potential for comparing. So I'm going to turn this over now to Greg Seymour, who will talk to us about the experiences of the Magnet project. Greg?
Thanks, Ruth. Okay, so the Magnet initiative, Measures for Advancing Gender Equality. It's a joint project between IFPRI, several other organizations here. Overall, kind of the broad aim of the project, which launched a couple years ago, is to develop and test new measures of agency, particularly in kind of areas where the existing tools are either not maybe as strong as we want, or there just really aren't that many. And so one of those areas is collective agency. So we can go to the next slide, Ruth. And so what we've been, and Ruth has been really, has been a big part of this. We've been, so Magnet has been working with Pradhan, an NGO based in India, and we've so we've developed, so working together, we've co-developed a survey module for measuring collective agency. I'll speak a little bit more about what's actually in that tool in the next slide, but the things to note here are it's really, we've been working directly with Pradhan, and so it's aiming to kind of, the tool has really been developed to specifically meet the needs in the context of Pradhan sponsored self-help groups in India. We'll be piloting the tool in 3 states happening later this summer, so in a couple months. I'll talk about this more in the next slide, but the kind of the interesting thing here with the tool is that there is both an individual component where we're going to interview, about 900 members of 150 self-help groups, randomly selected from around 30 village organizations. So it's a pretty, substantial sample of self-help groups. There'll be individual interviews, and then in addition to that, we're going to conduct group interviews. So similar to kind of like how community level surveys happen. It'll be a single interview, but with 3 to 5 leaders or longstanding members from every village organization and self-help group. Let's go to the next slide. That's going to that speaks to kind of one of our research objectives then is being able to do a comparison between to be able to compare kind of individual to group level information we're getting on collective agency. So what are our research objectives? I'm realizing the slide's kind of out of order, so this is sort of jumbled. Is to assess the reliability and validity of the survey module itself, just to understand how well it works and what kind of how strongly we can recommend it to others. The module itself, it's I've been speaking about it, but I haven't said what it exactly measures. So it's measuring intrinsic and instrumental collective agency. If you look at it, I think there are also elements related to collective efficacy and collective action, or really I think it came out in kind of what Ruth was saying, but they're interrelated concepts. And so this module that's aiming to measure collective agency, we're going to ask it at the individual level, and we're also going to then we're also going to ask it in that group setting. So the idea is one of the a hypothesis that we're testing or assessing is the extent to which that information, whether the information we get from the leaders of the group about how they perceive collective agency among their membership, to what extent does that information align with the perceptions of collective agency among the actual members? So I think it's a really interesting question. We're also going to look at what factors, individual and group level factors, drive a member's ability to exercise collective agency. And so that's going to be looking at, the group level interviews are also collecting a bunch of information about, group composition, leadership, and governance practices, things that are, I think, often missed, but I think could be very helpful to help us to understand kind of like what separates those groups that are really able to promote collective agency versus those that are less able to do that. And yeah, the pilot survey is happening very soon, so we're hoping to have results to start to report maybe by the end of the year, early next year, probably, maybe more realistically. But I think that's it. So thank you, everybody. Happy to answer questions at the end.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk about our project ANEW, applying new evidence for women's empowerment, that is part of this overall body of work on collective agency and other collective focused tools. And so in the ANEW portfolio, this is a portfolio of projects to develop new empowerment metrics for market inclusion interventions and expand the evidence base on empowerment and increase the capacity of implementing partners to use these metrics. So as you can glean from that, we're focused on developing a number of tools, and those that are focused on their collective are just part of it. It's a unique opportunity to focus on collectives because the projects within the portfolio work with a variety of different forms of collectives, ranging from self-help groups in India, larger farmer producer organizations in Guatemala, as well as cooperatives for in the case of a project focused on coffee cooperatives in Mexico. Something that these all have in common is that they're focused more on high value commodities and the accompanying interventions that are considered gender sensitive and aim to empower women. So if you look across these different types of collectives, and in the case of India with self-help groups, we see those are primarily focused on women and target women specifically. In the case of farmer producer organizations in Guatemala and the coffee cooperative focus in Mexico, more of these are heavily focused on men as primary members, but women are sometimes members at least, and sometimes formal members, but often are in this position of being accessory members. They get the right to the benefits and participation in the group and based on their husband's formal membership. And then there are often these women's advisory groups, et cetera, that are linked to these entities. So our partners in this is led by IFPRI. Our four projects that are in this portfolio one is LEAP, that's a Pradhan project in India. We have a TechnoServe project in Guatemala, Grameen Foundation supported work in India, as well as Root Capital in southern Mexico. And this work is funded specifically by the Walmart Foundation, both in the implementation of these four projects, as well as our the overall new project. So next slide, please. So as part of this work, we're developing a variety of metrics, but I'm also going to focus specifically on what we're doing related to the collective specifically. So these include an individual level M&E tool, a group level M&E tool, as well as an additional module for ProWEAI for market inclusion that can be that's part of our general suite of the ProWEAI for market inclusion impact evaluation tools. So I'm going to go into each of these in more detail. At this point, we don't really have results from these, but data collection is sort of finishing up and we'll be working on these soon. So with the individual level M&E tool or MEAL or MEL or whatever your phrase of preference is these days, it's designed to be integrated into regular M&E data collection. So, maybe this is quarterly or every 6 months. But the idea is with this overall tool that we're eventually going to be able to triangulate these data with our results from the ProWEAI impact evaluations and look at, sort of what components of this intervention are leading us, towards specific impacts. This particular M&E tool is sex disaggregated, so separate data collection with individual women and individual men. And there are specific modules in it that are related to participation in collectives and group decision making. And 2 of the projects in the portfolio are using this tool. With our group level M&E tool, so similar to the individual M&E tool, it's designed to be integrated into regular M&E data collection, and specifically with to be asked of a group of leaders of each individual group. So modules, there's specific modules related to how the group operates and group activities, including those that focus specifically on gender. And then the modules on group operation, focus on women's leadership or women's participation in leadership, et cetera. And 2 of the projects in the portfolio are using this tool. And then we have the ProWEAI for market inclusion, this module that's derived from the group collective agency module. It's based on a subset of items from some other metrics that have been developed, and it's being collected at baseline and endline these end-line surveys, many of them are in progress right now, and this is being collected across all 4 projects. And so the idea is that with these 3 different types of tools that are collected at the individual level, the group level, et cetera, we'll be able to triangulate some findings and have some ideas about which aspects of these are most meaningful for looking at impact, as well as processes that lead to impact. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I'm presenting on a project titled Overcoming Roadblocks to Women's Participation Through Advocacy Training. And this is a project with our partner ActionAid Nigeria, and it takes place in 3 states in Southwest Nigeria, depicted on this map: Oyo, Osun, and Ogun states. In those states, we've basically picked a study area where we took the universe of all rural wards in those 3 states, and then we randomly selected 150. We did stratification on local government area, and so we really shotgunned those across the states, each of them. Just to put into perspective, there are about 156 rural wards in Osun, so we went to almost all of those, and in other states there were a few, a bit more, but we tried to equalize the populations. What we're studying here is groups called Women's Action Committees. And these are not like some of the other studies you're hearing from my colleagues. These are not groups that were pre-existing in communities. They are newly formed groups. Our partner ActionAid Nigeria likes to bring together groups of women in a community. And these particular groups were women that were married, but between the ages of 18 and 50. So we were trying to target women that were economically active. So there were some kind of criteria we agreed upon with ActionAid Nigeria about them being economically active married women. And I'll get into a moment of why marriage was a criterion there. But they were then delivering a training program that's intended to confer individual and collective efficacy through many participatory activities with the women. We've got a baseline survey just wrapping up, and we'll have some lessons from that coming up that we can share more on. That's in July 2023. Our end-line survey is currently programmed to be between December 2023 and January 2024. The baseline focused on interviews with women, and the end-line survey will include interviews with women, interviews with the women's husbands, as well as interviews with local leaders in the community. We would have interviewed all of these folks at baseline as well, but there were budgetary limitations that precluded us doing so. But we really want to do the end line with all groups and have the funding lined up for that. Next slide, please. So for this project, basically we're trying to pull together groups, and we want to make sure that we've got a randomized controlled trial here. We have women in a control condition and women in 2 different treatment conditions. We selected these fully randomly. We did stratification based on community infrastructure and state. And so we want to get a sort of a equal number of each treatment arm in each state, and have those not have them be correlated at all with some of these infrastructure variables. So what does this amount to? Well, we have 450 wards. We have 13 women. ActionAid worked to get groups of 13, which was a number that they said worked well for them in not being too unwieldy with their teams of 2 facilitators, but sufficiently large to allow the women to have rich interactions with others. So that resulted in 5,850 women. We randomized these to 3 arms, as I mentioned. So we've got one arm, and across all arms, we bring women together and give them a civic education course. And part of the reason to have the civic education course is we need to see who are the types of people that show up and are told that they are invited to be part of a training program. We want to make sure that at baseline, all 3 treatment groups are similar to one another. So we're giving the same messaging and making sure that everyone is willing to come to this initial training. But then after that initial training, we have women in the control group who are not invited back to additional meetings. They may choose, they may meet women and find them a helpful group and continue to get together, but they will not be facilitated in interactions. In T1 and T2, Action Aid will provide training over a period of 5 months to women on leadership, organizing, advocacy, and their goal is to try to build women's collective agency and improve their communication with policymakers. And then additionally in T2, husbands of those women are all invited to a training on how they can support women's empowerment beyond the household, including in women's political and community participation. And we're going to analyze individual data from women's, from their husbands, as well as group level outcomes. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned the data collection. One of the things that, and a feature of this project as well, is we have a partner that is giving out grants, and that partner is advertising these grants in every community at every meeting, including in the control arm, including in the treatment arms. Everyone hears about the grant program. What we want to see at the end of this program is whether the treatment leads people to be more likely to apply for the grants, whether it makes the grant applications they submit higher quality, and whether local leaders who are going to be selecting recipients are more likely to give the grant to them. So the concepts we're measuring are collective agency, whether women apply for the grants as groups and have higher quality applications. Collective efficacy, so these are feelings of pride in the group, that the group feelings that the group has a lot in common, beliefs that the group can identify, organize around, and attain desired goals, and beliefs that women make good leaders. We're measuring individual efficacy as well. So this is belief that women can attain desired goals, and also looking to see if women are more likely to contact leaders and elites about their concerns, whether they attend community meetings, whether they believe that they can communicate their needs well, and whether they believe women have key roles beyond the homes. We'll look at collective action, whether the groups organize and act together. Social capital, we'll see if they participate more in groups and in community activities, whether they trust other women and community members, and whether they're discussing politics and public services more. And finally, collective achievements. We'll see if the women in the trained groups are more successful in getting a grant from their local government that is making decisions about who to award the grants. Thank you much, and I'm open for questions afterward.
Yeah, so the name is Eileen Chanji. Morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. I'm going to be talking about the work that we're doing in Uganda. So in Uganda, we're working with farmer producer groups, and these groups are divided into two. You have the master farmer network groups, and you have the non-farmer network groups, which is the control. For the farmer network groups, these are actually a group of farmers, men and women, that were trained by Mastercard Foundation, NARO, which is the National Agricultural Institute, the Pan-African Bean Research Alliance, on basically accessing resources like land, seed, linking them to markets, providing them with climate information, agronomic services to increase their decision-making. And this also, we looked at it from an ICT-based solution. The idea was enhancing farmers' skills, knowledge, decision-making capacities, getting women to be able to control, to have better control over incomes, increase their bargaining power. And this had to be done through the mobile payments. So basically what we call in Kenya, M-Pesa. And for the non-MFM groups, these were actually just farmer groups in other communities where we didn't actually carry out these MFN studies. Next slide, please. So to be able to select these groups, we had the multi-stage and purposive sampling procedures. So in Uganda, we went to 4 regions, 13 districts out of that, from the central, eastern, and southwestern districts, as well as the northern district. We were able to come across 653 farmers, 529 from MFN groups, 124 from the non-MFN groups. I would explain a little bit why we have probably less from the control groups. We also collected qualitative data. So we did 12 key informal interviews and 5 focus group discussions in the selected MFN districts. We were not able to do this in the non-MFN districts. I'm also going to explain that a little bit when I talk about the challenges that we faced in collecting the data. We also made sure that while we were collecting this data, it was sex disaggregated. So we collected information from men and female farmers, as well as the different groups. And we were not so interested in the household levels, but looking at men and women from different groups, but within different households as well. Next slide. So data collection happened in January this year, and basically now we have already written a working paper. We're just refining that and also moving to write other articles on it. So just giving you an idea of some of the concepts that we focused on and the type of questions that we asked. So I'm not going to go through all of the questions because this slide, I'm sure, is going to be shared. So just reflecting a little bit on collective agency, you would see the questions we had there was, do you feel you could also be a group member? So this was asked to women, this was also asked to men. Do you as an individual participate in group decisions? Are your views respected? If your views are not respected, why? Do you have an opportunity to speak in the group? Can you raise, you know, a grievance or an expect a fair hearing? You have all those other questions. So as I said, I won't read through all of them. Moving to the next slide. We also had some questions linking on collective action as well as social capital. Some of the questions on social capital relate to what benefits you get from linkages with other groups or other platforms that your group, you know, sort of like interacts with or engages with, and what type of benefits are those. And then you have other questions on in your various activities, whom do you prefer to work with? Are you comfortable working with men? Are you comfortable working with women? Or are you comfortable working with both? So trying to make sure that we picked questions relating to collective action, social capital, as I mentioned, and even before, collective agency and collective efficacy. Next slide. So apart from those questions that actually looked at the different concepts that we were interested in, we also collected some group characteristics that were also interesting, but that would be able to provide a more nuanced understanding of these different concepts. So we looked at other intersectional elements like the educational levels, marital status, occupation, age, the length of the individual, you know, being in a group, so group membership, the mode of membership, leadership roles, etc. Next slide. So what are some of the things that worked and what are some of the issues that we had? So of course, we were able to successfully align and map our research questions to some of the concepts that we are interested in, which would definitely allow a comprehensive collection of information, but also cross-learning with the other projects that have already presented before me. We are also looking at the possibility of computing an index, but as Ruth said, this also comes with its complications. So we're basically at the stage of discussing what is feasible and what is not. One of the issues we had was when we collected this data, this was during the time of the Ebola outbreak in Uganda. So basically what this meant was there were certain districts that we could not go to that we had mapped for the study because of the outbreak. And also even collecting not just the KIIs, but the focus group discussions, we had to limit that to certain areas. So that's why you would see sort of like an imbalance between the treatment group and the control group, where for the control group, we had like few numbers compared to the treatment group. Also, we have good information that's coming from the qualitative studies. So really understanding the why of the results that we're getting. That's also something that we are compiling the report on, and definitely looking forward to another meeting like this, where we can actually give more detailed results that we're getting from the project. Thank you.
Well, thanks, everyone. I'm just going to, in the interest of time, briefly talk about the Promise of Commons initiative. That is, it's quite ambitious. It seeks to strengthen collective management of the commons in 30 million acres in India. And it's a broad program towards system level change, but a big part of it is this learning agenda in terms of the people level outcomes. What extent is the initiative delivering inclusive benefits at scale, and how are those benefits distributed? There we are working through different types of groups, women's self-help groups, resource user groups. Those are both water user associations, forest user groups, and these block level federations. This initiative is led by the Foundation for Ecological Security, IFPRI, the Alliance, ICRAF, and other CGIAR centers are participating along with other NGOs and government agencies, supported by Co-Impact and other donors. The key aspect of this is that we have these indicators are going into the MALEA, monitoring, evaluation, learning, and impact assessment of the overall program. And the questions are being integrated into a group self-assessment form. So because it's part of this MALEA, it doesn't have as much, it's not a distinctive, it's not a being used in any kind of randomized control trial in this sense. But again, this is ongoing and we hope to have more findings when things are ready. I want to come back to just the next steps for this overall project. We are in the process, we have a drafty draft of a discussion paper that's presenting this framework and definitions. Now we're sort of getting the group together to look at how we've adapted those concepts to each context. And then what can we say even at this point about ways of measuring these? We will be making all of the tools from each of these projects available on the Gender Platform Resource Hub, and there will be then separate papers from each of the projects. So with that, let's wrap up and have some time for discussion. Ara, do you want to moderate the discussion?
Sure.
And I invite all the everybody, including also Hagar and Audrey, to come on video if you have bandwidth.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Okay, I see one question in the chat from Dee. She was curious if it's for Greg, and if you have a way to estimate the individual's level of engagement in the group and the survey to see if that might link to the collective's level of group efficacy and group action. Greg, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Dee. I'm thinking about the questionnaire. I think that is one of the yes. The answer is yes, and so we do have. I'm not exactly sure. We're measuring. We have questions around. I think attending meetings and speaking up, and then decision making in those meetings, and so that is. Maybe we can think about expanding how we, the measures we have there of kind of the participation in the group. But yeah, that's certainly one of the that's one of those. It's one of the research questions that we're hoping to be able to answer.
Thanks, Greg. Any other questions? You can feel free to just raise your hand and unmute. Or the speakers who only had 5 minutes to explain all this, so you also can just speak up and just explain further if you missed anything during your presentation. Actually, maybe let me go ahead. I was just listening to the presentations and I had a question for Ruth. I know that you at the beginning talked really briefly about like how difficult it is to come up with the one common tool from all these different projects. Do you have any other sort of things that you're learning just looking and talk through this different projects and talking with the PIs of each project?
So they're not new findings necessarily, but context matters a great deal. I think there's a big contrast between the India and, for example, Eileen's project, which is more mixed groups. And in fact, I was going to ask Eileen, give you a chance to explain a bit more about, from your qualitative findings, about the value of confidence working with men and women. In a lot of South Asia, there's this tendency to set up separate groups for men and women because culturally there are lots of constraints on women speaking in the presence of men, for example, and being comfortable. So at least building the collective agency of women within the space of where they are, there's more space for women to speak up if it is only women, and much more prohibitions against women speaking in public in the presence of men, as opposed to in many places in East Africa, at least, where there is more comfort in that. I remember Jemima and Juki, the first time when she was doing her dissertation work, she introduced me to a watershed group that was mixed, and the woman was a treasurer, or the treasurer was a woman. And I asked why, and they said, well, women are more trusted with money. And Jemima said she had found that in many, many cases. Now, this was shocking to me after my sort of India orientation, because women wouldn't have been in that kind of a public role as commonly. And so that's one of the reasons that I think we need to be able to look at both types of groups, and not saying one is necessarily better than the other, but looking at trying to build some evidence with qualitative as well as quantitative. And so maybe if there aren't a lot of other questions right now, asking Eileen if you'd want to speak to some of the qualitative findings you had and why you asked about, do you prefer working just with women, just with men, or with women and men?
Okay, so like Ruti said, the context is really very important. In Uganda, it's one of those countries, especially in the districts where we worked, where there've been multiple projects on empowerment. So I mean, joining CGIAR from 2017, I realized like 5 years before, we had like 2 projects on IDRC, really looking at how to, get women to the next level. So what we actually find is that, one, the groups actually have gender quotas. So that means there's a number that is set aside for women to be leaders. And as you rightly said, most of the positions reserved for women are treasurer, secretary, it's like the sure the women would be there, they would make the notes, and then the women, would actually keep the money and not use the money, unlike if the men are the ones that actually have the money. But still, you would find in some cases, the women are either due to education levels, so low education levels, or not having the confidence, do not, talk as much as the men. Where you would find some cases where the men would be able to, have more of a voice as a result of the fact that they've been members of not just members, they've held positions in the groups before. And also then when we actually have the question of who are you comfortable, working with, is it more the men or more the women? We realize that Often we say women like working with more women because, we understand basically what we're going through, the spaces for discussions and sharing experiences. But what we realized in Uganda, which was interesting, was the women were actually engaging more with the men because of the opportunities that the men had. So I think women are becoming more strategic. So it's not really one or the other, but basically depending on the context, they look at who do I engage with that would actually get me more agency, more voice, or it's going to get me more spaces for me to be able to get something. So interestingly, women are taking advantage of those opportunities that sometimes and once are not really so open to take themselves to the next level. So that's really what we're seeing. Thanks.
Thanks, Eileen. I see two more questions in the chat, and I'll go with Salom's question. Just curious to know what the high value commodities you refer to and whether this is from the group perspective, individual perspective, or the researcher perspective. How does this play out in situations where we have mixed members in collectives, given that men and women may value different commodities? I assume this is for Jessica, but Salom, feel free to just clarify.
Sure. So high value commodities in this case are specifically commodities that are sort of sold outside the local community and can demand a larger price. So it's in terms of who's defining it, it's defined by the market, so to speak. But sort of for some specific examples of that, to make it more clear, in the case of the Root Capital Project in Mexico, it's coffee. In the case of the farmer producer organizations supported by TechnoServe in Guatemala, they are high value vegetables that can be sold and exported internationally. So some specific beans, broccoli, avocado, etc. are part of that. In the case of the self-help groups in India, there are a set of what are named winter crops. So WINNER, not winter with a T. So with those winter crops, they are a number of different things, and so individuals can select from them, and they're being promoted by the NGO. They include some specific varietals of wheat. I can't remember everything that's included, but there is some individual farmers are able to select from them, but they are, so people still have autonomy over what they're growing, but it's simply sort of a way of aggregating these higher value commodities so that can be sold. They can be sold because often individuals can't necessarily sell for an export market, but with the support of a collective of some form, they can.
Thanks, Jessica.
Is your question?
So Elizabeth had a question about, for Ruth, I think, if there are any plans to develop a common measure of collective agency despite the challenges you mentioned.
So that was the original intention. I think maybe where we're coming out is not the whole genome, but slices of it, where we can come out with, and that's why we'll be posting these tools on the resource website, and in our paper, what we'll be doing is taking how we have operationalized this in other studies. So Audrey and Hagar have been reviewing, in this review of the literature, they were pulling out all the instruments, how people were defining it, and then how they were operationalizing these concepts. And we drew on that in creating our own instruments. And now we hope to provide this in more of a consolidated manner to say that, so people who are looking to measure this themselves can do it. Now, why didn't we do something like we did with WEAI of really developing something standardized? Well, big resource constraints. in ProWEA, we were able to give really substantial top-up grants to each of 11 participating projects in order to get them to agree to implement a standardized set of qualitative and quantitative instruments that then we could do. We had a lot of resources to do the kind of comparative analysis, both quantitative and qualitative. This is a much smaller grant. And so we're just adding a little bit of people's time and very small additional resources to large other projects. And so it hasn't been possible for us to push and say, no, you must implement it exactly this way. On the plus side, I think there's been a lot that we have learned by negotiating everything to learn what is valued by ActionAid in Nigeria when you are doing this kind of a project versus PABRA when they're doing this kind of a project, and PRADAN and FES and all. They've been great partners in shaping this.
Thanks. Thanks, Ruth. So I'll come to Hazel after we address the question from Florence. Is that okay, Hazel? Yeah. The Florence asked, in Uganda, most collectives are predominantly women. Is this the case in other countries? Anyone who can talk about this? Katrina, Jessica, Greg, Kalyani.
I can chime in. So across the new portfolio, the self-help groups in India are focused primarily on women, but in our Latin America projects, which are the coffee-focused cooperative in southern Mexico and the vegetable-focused FPOs in Guatemala, they're actually primarily men who are the primary members, and women are sometimes members, and a lot of this is linked to like land ownership, and so women sometimes own land and are members, but are also sometimes sort of, I don't know a good term for it, like auxiliary members, and sort of they receive many of the benefits through the fact that their husband is a formal member.
Thanks. Okay. Anyone? Or Katrina, were you about to? No? Okay, good. Okay, Hazel.
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to kind of bring up a more kind of conceptual question. And I'm sorry if I missed the early part, so maybe that you talked about it there, but maybe it's kind of worth revisiting that point. So I'm just coming from a recent conference on feminist economics, and one of the criticisms that is often leveled at around discussions around empowerment is that empowerment is often conceptualized at the individual level, and I think this entire activity is trying to actually address this point that we actually do need to understand this also at the collective level. But how are you seeing that relationship then between the individual levels of empowerment that we're measuring and these collective measures that you're developing and collecting, and how are those related, and especially around analysis? What is your thinking around using those together? And I think this is a question also for the broader group, not just for the people in the projects, but if others have thoughts, I would also be really keen to hear. Thanks.
Katrina, go ahead, start.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I will say that in some sense, I think of it conceptually. There's a lot of interesting things we could say about it. I can say that empirically, I'm really interested to see, we have measures in our study in Nigeria where we're looking at women's perception of their own efficacy, but also their perception of their group's efficacy. And so seeing where whether we build both individual and collective efficacy, where we see the most movement, how that varies with some of the characteristics of the group and the women themselves, I think will be very interesting. So I hope we can say more about that once we've got some data collection underway. But I completely agree. We need to understand, achievements at the collective level. Our project starts with the sitting women together. And again, they're not organic groups, so it's a bit of a different animal than some settings, but they're sitting together and trying to identify their common interests and then a plan for achieving those common interests. So sort of seeing to what extent they see their interests as being linked and common, and then they see that their group is better able to achieve the outcomes than they would themselves. I think we'll have more to say about that. I would turn to Ruth on the conceptual piece because I think she's really done a lot of thinking on that side, but I hope we can empirically support exactly what Ruth says. So over to you, Ruth.
Well, thanks. That gave me a chance to put up our conceptual framework, which is exactly at this. And Hagar or Audrey, if you want to chime in on this, but and this has not gone through the prettifying process of the framework, but trying to show that there's an interaction between the two levels. And we don't have all the evidence on this, but if you were to take, for example, very disempowered women who have to get permission to even go to a meeting and all, and who don't have a lot of self-efficacy, a lot of self-confidence, then or imagine that versus a group of quite articulate women with a lot of experience in organizing. Those two different groups might have very different outcomes in terms of the collective agency and the collective achievements. However, I think Katrina's example is a great one of as you build that self-confidence, then, and you get some achievements. So building the individual level agency and achievements can reinforce the collective, and as you build the collective, it can really, for example, we have lots of examples of where as women's organizations have shown that they can deliver on improved incomes or nutrition for the family, then husbands and mother-in-laws are more likely to approve of women attending the meetings. So there can be an interaction between the two, I think. We don't have it fully fleshed out, but that's part of what we're trying to do in this paper is talk about that we do really need to go beyond just measuring this at the individual level, I think.
Thanks, Ruth. I don't see any questions in the chat. Does anyone have any other questions? Please feel free to just come in and unmute. Yes.
Actually, so can I come in with one thing that came up earlier about the group composition? Bina Agarwal has done work on, and others have done work on showing that within group composition, having at least 30%, that, the numbers are a little hard to pin down, but when there are at least 30% women, then it's easier for women to actually participate. And interestingly enough, that applies not just in forest user groups in Nepal and India, but Harvard Business Review has similar findings from corporate America, and how teams within business schools, if, depending on the composition of the teams, will affect. And if you think about this, of elite business schools in the US, these are not women who are shy. You wouldn't assume that. And yet the structure of the organization will affect the extent to which women can effectively engage. And so I think this is part of where we're trying to get at both the structure issues and the individual issues. Otherwise, there is a tendency to, as Jemima Njuki and others refer to, fix women rather than fixing systems. Katrina, you were gonna.
Yeah, I'll just quickly come in on that point. We're doing work on deforestation policy preferences in Malawi, and we've been doing an RCT. We finished an RCT there. We're writing it up, working on it right now. But we were assembling groups of people to deliberate, to first say what are their preferred policy preferences from a set of them, and then deliberate for an hour or two, and then again indicate their preferences, secret ballot wise. And then we're basically now analyzing the content of those deliberations. But we varied the group composition everywhere from all men to all women, and every single combination of women and men in these 6-member groups. And we're trying to understand, how does the content of deliberation, the talk time relative to their number, vary of women, so that we can kind of see where exactly are the shift points. So excited to hear that there's other work on this, and I in this group here, that maybe there's new work that's coming out as well that we can engage on. But we're definitely seeing that women's influence increasing. It's amazing how, when you still have one man in the group, sometimes that man feels that it is his destiny to lecture the group. In ways where even with 2 men, we don't see as much as the single man that feels really the desire and need to lead. We're finding, we're really analyzing now content analysis of what's said, amount of talk time, how comments are recognized. And so we've got some grad students kind of coding this up. So we'll hopefully have more to say soon. We're presenting it at the American Political Science Association annual meetings coming up in September. So I'm really interested in this question for anyone else that also is working on this. Would love to engage more about it, including you, Vina.
Thanks, Katrina. That sounds like a really interesting study. If you have anything to share about that study just later, just let me know, or use the D groups just to share with everybody. Okay, I think we're almost at the time. This has been a wonderful discussion. I was surprised to see so many people have stayed to the end. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining the webinar today, and thanks so much, Ruth and the team, for sharing your work with us. Again, please reach out to us for questions and opportunities to present your work. And yeah, thank you so much. I have to see you all at our next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you all. Yeah.
Thank you all.